That's what I heard. That's what I'm saying. If it migrated in your room or something, give it to Kyler and he'll give you a huge reward. This is going to be a little bit different. I want to tell you some stories. And these are stories about Christians. And this is part one, so I'm going to try to tell you 3 stories today. This first person you probably never heard of, but I think you should hear about him. And after I tell her story, I want to stop for a minute because it leads up to a lot of really interesting questions, okay? I never got to know her personally, but I know her daughter pretty well. Her daughter actually comes to Anchor House every couple years and tells this story herself. But I'm going to tell you her story, okay? Now, I don't know how much you were taught in public school or homeschool or wherever you went, Catholic school, wherever you went, about history of World War II, okay? But let me sort of set this up. World War II didn't start at Pearl Harbor. That just started for the U.S. when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. It had been going on since 1939. In 1939, Adolf Hitler decided to invade Poland. And he made a deal with the Russians, who were kind of their enemy. But Stalin got tricked by Hitler, because later on Hitler invaded Russia as well. But he got tricked by Hitler to saying, hey, listen, why don't we invade Poland together? You come in from the east, I'll come in from the west. You can have this part of Poland, and we'll take this part of Poland. And Stalin said, that's a great idea. So in 1939, World War II technically started because the British and the French had a deal with Poland that if Hitler invaded those guys, they'd come to his rescue. But they actually did nothing except twiddle their thumbs and try to keep Hitler away from them, the French didn't do a very good job because a few months later invaded Paris as well. But what happened is the Russians came racing into the border, across the border of Poland, and the Germans came this way, all right? And the woman I'm going to tell you about was 17 years old when this happened. And so she was just out of high school, or just in high school, okay? And she's actually written a book about this. Her name's Irene, okay? Gut Opodike. And this is what she looked like when she was about 17, 18 years old. And the Russians came in, and I don't know if you know anything about Russians, but they were super brutal. Now, she's not Jewish. She's a Polish girl. But the Russians figured they owned everybody and everything and every woman. And so they grabbed her and brutally gang raped her, right? Now, she was a Christian gal. She was a Roman Catholic at the time. Eventually she became a Protestant and moved to California, which is where she raised her daughter. But they brutally raped her, and she ended up in the hospital for quite a while. And so kind of a horrid start. So she just gets out of the hospital. Now she's 18 years old. She happens to be fluent both in Polish and in German. And then what Hitler did is he went, I'm going to get that Stalin now, and in a complete surprise attack that went almost all the way to Moscow, he invaded Russia. Is this familiar to any of you guys in your history? Okay. He invades Russia, and he did it through Poland. So all the Russians got booted out, and all the Germans came in. Now, the Russians didn't have a big deal about Jews, but the Germans did. And so they came in, and they find this young 18-year-old gal, and she's kind of happy that the Russians are out. And so they give her a job. In fact, they give her 2 jobs. They find out she's fluent in German, as well as being young and kind of a go-getter. And so they give her a morning job, and they give her 9 Jews to work with. And she's in charge of a laundry for like the German soldiers or uniforms and stuff like that. And then at night, she works in a cabaret or a cafe. She serves meals and takes orders in a German officer club. It's an officer cafe. Okay, no enlisted men, right? So that's what she's doing. Now, things are happening. This happens for a few months, and she understands German perfectly. And as she's serving dinner, she hears these 2 guys. They have SS officer uniforms on. And she hears him going, you know, by this time next week, there won't be a Jew left here in this town. And she'd already heard rumors of towns just up the road being annihilated, liquidated. And at that time, what they would do is they wouldn't just run the Jews off. They were beginning to exterminate them. They didn't have concentration camps yet, but what they had is they had these huge moving trucks, right? And the moving trucks, what they would do is they'd con the people into saying, we're just going to move you from one place to another. We'll take all your luggage and all that kind of stuff. You need just to jump in here, and we're going to haul you in this big moving van. But of course, as soon as they shut the doors in the moving van, they had it so that they got asphyxiated by the carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide from the engine. It would just pump in there, and they'd kill them all, right? So that's what they were doing. They were killing Jews up the road. They hadn't gone to the mass murder pits yet, but it was coming. So she hears about this. She's got these 9 people that she's kind of the boss of. She's your age. And she goes down and she goes, you got to get out of here. You got to run. You got to leave and get as far as you can, which was next to impossible because Germany controlled the whole country. And if you went west or you went south, you were still in German-controlled world. And they begged her, you got to help us. You got to help us. She goes, I live above the cafe in a one-room room. What can I do? There's 9 of you. I can't do anything for you. And that night she went back to work. And an officer came up and he goes, you know, Irene, you're such a great worker. And I'm just moving into this big giant mansion. It used to be owned by Jews. And I need a housekeeper. So this will be your last night to be working in the cafe. So she was taken from the cafe, put in this big house to prepare meals, to keep it up, because as an officer, he was a pretty high up officer. He was in his 60s, early 60s. And he needed somebody who would keep the house clean and he entertained a lot of other officers. And so he put her in that position, okay, Irene in that position. Now this big giant house had a big basement. It actually had been owned by Jews, and eventually she found out not only had a basement, but behind something in the basement was another secret tunnel that you could actually escape through. And she got this idea. She told her friends, listen, I have an idea. It's probably just temporary, but I have an idea. When this guy goes to work and he goes this time, you come to this address and I'll hide you there. So, now get this, in a Nazi officer's house, in his basement, she put 9 Jews. That's gutsy. What do you think would happen to her if she got caught? Yeah, like that. What do you think would happen to them? They'd all be killed, okay? They'd all be killed. This is a massive insult. And so these 9 people were down there, and they had to be really quiet. But this officer got up, go to work every day, and what she would do, she's really brilliant. Again, she's 18, 19 years old now, and this is still 1939, right? America's not in the war yet. They'd come out of the basement, and because he was an officer, he had an abundance of food. They'd eat all the scraps, okay? And she'd lock all the doors so that he couldn't come back in. She'd double lock from the inside all the doors. She'd say, you know, I'm kind of fearful. She didn't tell him what she was fearful of. But she'd lock all the doors, and then what they would do is help her clean the house. And he would come back and he goes, you know, Irene, I don't know how a young woman like you is able to accomplish so much. You got the food, you got the house is always sparkling. And she goes, well, it's just, I just work hard. I just work hard. And this went on year after year after year, where they lived in the basement like mice. And then as soon as he went to work, they'd come out. And if there's big parties and stuff with lots of German officers, they'd all be hiding down there, but it would have helped prep food and things like that. And it seemed like a deal. And then one day, Irene needed some food because she had kind of a carte blanche to go to the stores and pick up all the food she needed. She needed some food for an event to going out. And as she was walking down the main boulevard of the town, she came upon SS officers dragging a Polish family out of the house because they had hidden Jews. And they had children with them. They shot the Jews right there in the street. And then they took this couple's children and hung them in front of the parents. And then shot the parents. If you saw something like that, what would happen? What would be the response? What would be your response?
That's evil.
Pardon?
That's evil.
Yeah, that would be your definite response.
I'd run. I would not stop running.
Yeah, it would. I mean, imagine just the horror, the shock, the brutality. And she was just a huge bundle of nerves because she's got a secret. It's not just what she saw, it's what's going to happen to her if she gets caught. And she's got this huge, she's just a bundle of nerves. And she gets what she needs. She goes back home. She's shaking. She tells her friends what she saw. But because she was so rattled, she made one fatal mistake. She forgot to lock the door. That evening, early in the evening, earlier than the officer would normally come home, although he did oftentimes swing in, but because he had to work on the lock, there was plenty of time to run down to the basement. He walked in while she was sitting with the two of her Jewish friends, not 9 of them, but 2 of her Jewish friends at the table. Who are these people? Where are they from? It was obvious what they were. And he went absolutely Richter. Absolutely Richter. And he pulled out his gun, he swung it around, and then he went upstairs and just got himself stone drunk. She said that was one of the most horrid periods of time of her life. Everything, she's dangling by a thread. Finally, he calls her upstairs and he goes, all right, I have a proposition for you. You have one of 2 choices. Make the one you want. I should shoot you for this. And of course, all those other stinking Jews that you have. Again, he didn't know about all the rest of them. I should shoot you for this. And I really want to. But if you agree to be my mistress, I'll let you live, but I never want to visibly see them. I don't want to know about them. They don't exist. You've obviously kept them hidden this long. I never want to see them again. What would you do? If you're a girl, what would you do? If that was you have 2 choices. Can you imagine being presented with those 2 choices? Said, okay, I'll be your mistress. Not because she wanted to be, but the lives of 9 other people hung on her decision, as well as her own. Now, the Polish didn't particularly like the Germans. And they didn't like people that they saw cohabitating or working in concert with the Germans. She was a Catholic gal. She was very, very much a faithful Catholic, lover of Jesus. And people began to notice that she would get to ride in this officer's car, that this officer seemed really buddy-buddy with her. And they presumed, and through the grapevine, they heard that she was his mistress. And when she went to get communion one day, the priest said, not for you. In fact, you don't need to come back here anymore. Behind her back, Poles are grumbling, but of course the Nazis got everything in an iron grip. But the war began to change. Meanwhile, while this is going on, we're clicking away years now, 1940, 1941, 1942, 1943, 1944. She's a young adult now. And this officer, by the way, was married. He had a wife in Germany. He'd go on leave sometimes and come back. She knew nothing about his mistress. The Russians are making advances, and their advances are coming into Poland. And by this time, there's not only 9 people down below, but one of them is about to have a baby. One of the married couples is about to have a baby. And now all the tide's shifting, and now the danger is not from the Nazis, because they're starting to pack up and leave. It's from the patriotic Poles that exist that are looking for vengeance, and it's certainly from the Russians. So now who do you think's in the crosshairs? Irene, again, because she's seen as a mistress of the Nazis. And her life will be snuffed out just like that, brutally as well. And so as the Russians are getting closer, her friends say, you got to get out of here. You've got to get to safety. The German grip on things was crumbling, and there's all kinds of displaced people. And each one of them wrote a letter about what she did for them. All 9 of them wrote a letter and gave them to her and says, if anybody ever questions you, this is our names, this is the story. Then they put her in a hay cart. They literally buried her with hay. And the Germans had already left. The German officer had gone back to his family. And they got her out of Poland in a hay cart. Okay? Well, the German officer got home. The war's over, and his wife found out that he had a mistress in Poland. So she booted his sad butt right out into the street. And he was living in an alley in scraps. If you know anything about the state of Germany after the war, the tide turned the other direction. It was really tough for them. And in the meantime, Irene is going to displace people groups. They had these huge centers where the American military, the British military, the Russians, the French, they would get people and try to figure out how to get them back to where they belong. Or if they had no place to go, a lot of times, especially if they were Jewish and they survived, they'd send them to Israel. And at this displaced peoples group is Irene. And she can't go back to her homeland because her homeland's now under communist control. Everybody there is going to think that she's a traitor, that she was literally, but actually not on her own, in bed with the Germans. And so her life's no good in Poland. She has nowhere to go, and she's talking to an American officer and explaining the story, and then she pulls out all the letters and shows him. And he said, Irene, you are exactly the kind of person we want in America. And she got a free ticket to New York City. Her friends had given her names of people in America. When she got to America, she called them. Her English was very poor, but when she called them, they said, and they read the letters, they got her a job, they got her a place, they took care of her like crazy. In the meantime, the German officer is having the worst days of his life. And ironically, a couple of those Jews found out about it. And they actually started sending money so he could survive, because he could have had them killed. And even though it's for selfish reasons, he still allowed them to live. And they actually began to take care of him. And one of them, the one who had the baby there, he became kind of what we call here a Hanai, a pretend grandfather to that little baby. Now Irene moves to New York City. And she's going to work one day, and as she sits down at a little outdoor coffee stand, she sees this American officer comes by, and lo and behold, it's exactly the same officer that had given her the free pass to America. And he spots her, and she spots him. They sit down and have coffee. One thing leads to another, and then she's wearing a wedding ring. Ends up in LA with him, has 3 kids, and doesn't ever tell anybody her story. Until around 2005, there was this phenomena that was going on in America about Holocaust deniers. people going, the Holocaust never really existed. That you're just getting a bunch of propaganda, blah, 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 blah. And it ticked her off so bad, she goes, I'm telling my story. And so this is the book that she wrote, okay? And she told all about this kind of stuff that happened to Poland. She told all about what happened to her. And so she started going into colleges and high schools and telling students her story, what took place in her story, the horrors of it all that she saw, that she lived through, and stuff like that. She became a really strong, booming Christian, and so brought that to the table as well everywhere where she went to speak. And her daughter, who's carried on that story, is also going around and speaks to many Jewish groups, and always ends up showing what this woman who gave up her virtue, literally, was able to do, that not only saved lives, but demonstrated a kind of selflessness that most people don't have. By the way, she's got, in Israel, they have these certain monuments to the righteous Gentiles. Her name's on one of those. So here's a question for you. Was Irene's decision to become a mistress, a Nazi officer, right or wrong? I'll wait. You've got to have an opinion. Yeah.
For me, it's wrong because it's in her case, it's adultery, or for him, it's adultery, but she's also aiding in that, which makes her a fortress at the same time.
So if you were in her position, you'd say we're all going to die.
But I would say God uses what was wrong for good.
Okay. Yeah.
I'd say the fact that the question was asked in the first place is wrong. So she made the right decision in saving those lives, but he made the wrong decision in asking the question.
Yeah. I'm not asking about the Germans' decision. I'm asking about hers. We can all agree that Germans are rat. She comes to you for counsel. You're a friend. She tells you the story. What do you tell her to do? You're a believer. She's a believer.
I know why it's right. Because people were denying the Holocaust happened. And she wrote this book. And if she would have said no, she wouldn't have written that book.
Okay. Well, you can see how it turned out well in the end. But at that moment of decision, she had to make a moral decision. She had to make a value decision. Yeah.
I must say, it was a hard decision, but I think she was in the right because she was saving. She was like almost dying to this herself, but she was saving 9 other people in the process.
Yeah. It wasn't her idea to be a mistress. Any other thoughts? These are kind of questions that you need to wrestle with, because life is full of these kinds of questions. It's real easy to paint big, broad strokes of morality. This is right, this is wrong. But I have friends who smuggled Bibles into communist countries. At the border, they say, do you have anything with you that you shouldn't have? And my friend, you know how he answered? He answered, what did he say? Oh, he said, no. Oh, no, he said, no, like that. I went, no. And he's shaking his head, yes. I go, that's cheating. Doesn't work. No other opinions? Right or wrong? If you're in a counselor, what would you tell her to do? Okay. Yeah.
Well, it was wrong to her. She probably didn't want to.
She didn't want to do it.
Yeah, so it was wrong to her.
But she chose.
She chose to do it. So the question, let's step back a second. Did she sacrifice herself? Is that wrong to do? Okay. Now, we think of sacrificing, I step in front of you, take the bullet, right? She sacrificed her body. She sacrificed her reputation to save the lives of other people, right? It was not, to her, this was a sacrificial act. It happened to have sex all over it, but it wasn't of her choice or desire. And the German officers, oh, come with me, you're going to be in danger. And she goes, no way. You know? She was only doing it for one reason only, 9 people and a baby in the basement. 9 people that go on to have families, go on to have lives. And for her, from her vantage point, this was something that God put in front of her, and she had to make a super hard decision. Right? And this is my view. I believe she made the right decision. I believe she did the right thing because her motives were completely different. She had no sinful motives in her mind at all. She merely saw herself as offering herself as a sacrifice in this kind of situation, and her reputation. But it's a heavy story. You know, and God forbid that any of us are put in those kinds of situations. I know when she was 17 or 18, she would have never imagined that would have been the situation that God put her in. And he used her greatly after that. Okay? All right. We'll go to a little happier one now. This is God's rebel. I love this story. Now this guy lived back in the 1700s. And every single one of you are a beneficiary of what this guy did, but you don't know it, because you probably don't know this guy. Okay? Ever heard of him? Robert Rakes? Does that ring a bell? Huh? Yeah, a long time ago. Yeah. Like George Washington era and stuff like that. So Robert Rakes is a British businessman. He was chubby, he wore a wig, you know, your typical British big guy. Very, very devout Christian. Okay? And he lived in a world of changing times. Many of you know this if you studied, you know, how societies work. But the society was changing from a farm-driven economy where you had landowners and people working, the serfs working the land and crops and stuff like that. And it was moving into the Industrial Revolution. Okay? Industrial Revolution means there's factories popping up everywhere. And factories mass producing different kinds of things. And they were using coal and wood and stuff to heat these factories. And they had assembly lines. They didn't have, like my friend, he actually is the engineer for the assembly lines for Amazon, right? He designs all those. And there are literally no humans picking things up and putting them in boxes. It's all machines. In the Industrial Revolutions, it was all people screwing things in, turning the knobs, and doing all the hard work. And what this caused is it caused the people who were doing work on the farms to move into the city because they had a desperate need for people. And they paid junk wages. These are pretty much uneducated people coming out of a farm, just minimal amount of ability to read and write. And they put them to work in the factories. And the factories would work from Monday through Saturday, the 6-day week. And they were only off Sundays because the British was a Christian nation, and they said, well, you should go to church. Okay? And most of them lived in these squalors, big tenement houses and stuff like that, a lot of disease and stuff like that. And the children, as you can see pictures of it, the children were put to work in the factories. Dangerous jobs, but what it meant is that they came out of it, and the only thing they could do, the only thing they knew what to do is work in a factory. They had no skills, no education, no reading, no writing, any of that kind of stuff. They were stuck in a wheel of poverty that just kept turning. And Robert Rakes, he had a newspaper, he was a publisher, kind of wealthy guy, lived in the upper crust stuff, but a really super devout Christian. He looked at it and he goes, this sucks, this is not good. I don't like the way our culture is moving. I don't like what's happening in our society right now. I don't like the fact that there's all these kids on the street, and on Sunday mornings, they're not in church, but you see them running around, they're getting into trouble, they're vandalizing stuff, and they're turning into little mini gangs. He goes, this is not good. We need to do something about this. And there are other people voicing the same thing, but what are you going to do? they're economically forced to have to work, go to work all day, and they were like 12-hour days. They weren't 8-hour days with a lunch break and that kind of stuff. And these kids, there's really no time to do anything, and no family's going to let their kid just drop out of school. So Robert Raikes got this idea. He's going, okay, how do we evangelize this group of people? How do we help them rise above poverty level? How do we ensure that they can have the skills so they can break out of the factories and actually get other kinds of jobs where you need the ability to read and write and stuff like that? And he got this really bright idea. He goes, what if we took the churches are all empty after 12, what if we took the churches and we made a school out of that for street kids? And so he came up with this idea. He goes, we could feed them lunch, and we'll use the Bible as our curriculum. We'll use the Bible to teach them how to read and write by using Bible verses, so we can evangelize them in. They'll have chapel. Didn't you guys go to a school that had chapel? So we'll have chapel so we can present the gospel, and then they'll learn the Bible because that's what they're going to use to read and write. And he got a few friends that thought it was a good idea too. And so they went to the vicar. The vicar is the pastor in England. The vicar of this church that they were all part of. And they go, we got this great new idea. They were the Imagineers of the 1700s. And they laid out this idea. And guess what they did? It's the Sabbath. You can't work on the Sabbath. That's the holy day. And we're ministering to people. It looks like work. When you're teaching people, instructing, that's not a good thing. And they went from church to church, and they got turned down. Nobody was interested in that idea, except for one little church. So we'll give an idea. We'll give that a try. Finally, Robert Raikes finally, okay, we got someplace to start. So they started. They rousted up people to make lunches for them so the kids could. This is the only real meal that they had, a nice healthy meal, not gruel. They fed them a meal and they enrolled them in class, and it was strict. You couldn't just you had to show up, but it was a super privileged. These are underprivileged kids. It was super privileged, and these kids got in there and they started learning how to read and write, and all of a sudden there was a difference. There's a difference in the neighborhood. There's a difference in the community. Within a couple of years, you could see how these kids who were once a bunch of little varmints and getting in trouble were now stepping up to the plate and getting better jobs and being able to break out of the cycle of poverty and that whole thing. And finally, another church goes, what you're doing there, we'd like to do here. And so they started a school on Sundays in that church. And then one by one, like little mushrooms, churches started adopting these schools on Sundays for these kids in poverty. Guess what that became? Sunday school. That's why you go to Sunday school. That's why you ended up going to Sunday school. That is left over from his brilliant idea, because he asked this question: which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill? And he said, I'm saving lives on Sunday. Don't give me this Sabbath stuff. We're changing, we're rocking people's lives, we're leading to the Lord. This is what God would prefer us to do. And he revolutionized all of England. And if you ever went to Sunday school, you can thank Robert Raikes. Okay? And you guys know that story? Kind of a cool story. Okay, I got one more for you. John Newton, ever heard of him? Another guy right around the same area. John Newton's another British guy. Came from upper middle class family. He got into sailing. Got to be a captain of a ship. And his story is kind of interesting. It has an interesting twist because he was a new Christian. And he got to join, he became a captain of a slave ship. Now, slavery at this time was legal in England and every other country except for parts of North America. Like the southern states, you could do slavery, but the northern states would not allow it. Every other country slavery was completely welcome. Africa being one of the most active slave trading. The Africans would steal guys from one tribe, sell them to another tribe, or sell them to the Arabs and stuff like that. So everybody's doing slavery. It was a big business. And he became a Christian, and he's the captain of a slave ship. And he'd been on ships that had slaves before, but never as a captain. Now it's his responsibility to care of all these slaves as they're taking him. The British ships would take them from Africa to the West Indies, actually to like Bermuda and places like that. And that's where they had all their plantations and stuff the British did there. And as he's sailing ships back and forth between Africa and the United States area, the Caribbean, he's starting to get really convicted. There's something wrong with this. And finally, as his faith grew, because he started out as a baby Christian, as his faith grew, he realized he could no longer be a captain of a ship. And not only could he no longer be that, but that he had sinned against God and against man. And he went through a really, really heavy repentance. A really, really heavy repentance. And he decided he was going to give up, abandon being a sailor, ship captain, which was a very good, lucrative career, and decided he would study and become a pastor of a church in England, which he did. Okay? And turned out to be a super humble guy, but he also had a talent. He was a writer, he was a musician. But the burden of slavery that he had participated in just weighed heaven. He knew Christ had forgiven him, but he felt like he needed to do something more. So he penned a song. It starts like this: Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. You know it? That's John Newton. And he was influenced by the shame that he had from slave trading. When you read that first line, saved a wretch like me, it's because he was looking backwards at the wretched stuff that he had done. But he just didn't write a song about it. What Newton did is he began to take his energy and his efforts, because this song got really, really popular, really, really fast. Okay? Think of the most popular worship song that you're singing right now and multiply that by about 1,000 times. Okay? He took no money for it. He wasn't in the money business. He wasn't a rock star. He was just a pastor who wrote a song that everybody started singing in churches everywhere. But it gave him a platform to be able to talk against the slave trade. And all of a sudden, and you're going to meet another hero later on, not today, but later on, who he joined up with, that began to agitate the parliament in Britain against slavery and say, we are a Christian nation. We shouldn't be doing this kind of stuff. And he was one of the loudest voices. And so because of that, eventually, because of Newton's work and the work of his team, eventually Britain became the first nation to banish slavery. In fact, they went the other direction. The captains now went out looking for slave ships. They were gunships, British gunships, looking for slavers, and they would take and release all the slaves and throw all the slavers into jail. Became the first nation. They went into India. And said, you will no longer have slavery in India. And they said, what? That's what we do. And he goes, it's not what you do anymore. Because we got bigger guns, got more people that are armed, and you're going to stop slavery. Oh, by the way, you're going to stop the women from throwing themselves on the funeral pyres of their late husbands, which is what they were doing. Says, that's part of our religion. They go, not anymore. You're not going to do that. That's not what God wants. And so he was a world changer, taking a really horrible background and a convoluted one as a Christian, sorting it out, and then taking the gift that God had given him for writing music. He wrote a whole bunch of them, but most of those songs you wouldn't know them, you wouldn't sing them. But he wrote this one song that is still rocking people today, still changing lives today. Because people are still finding themselves, not with slavery, but with other kinds of other varminty stuff they've been into, in the same place that John Newton found himself. Kind of cool, huh? So those are my heroes for today, just 3 of them. Any questions, any thoughts? Do you guys have any heroes so far in your life? Besides myself. I know I have a hero. I'm just kidding. Yeah.
Paul.
Paul, okay. Not outside of the Bible, any heroes? Any people you've heard of, look up to, you'd like to meet? I'll be telling you more about some people. Some of them I have met, some I haven't. One gal who actually wrote me a resume for Bible school when I went there, her name was Corrie ten Boom, which you might have heard of her because she and her sister were thrown in a Nazi concentration camp too. So there are people around that when we look at their stories, you go, man, what a gutsy person that is. And you don't have to be a hero on a macro scale. Believe it or not, many of you are going to be somebody else's hero because they'll look back and they'll go, it was this one person that spoke into my life. And you maybe have long forgotten that and just it's not a thing anymore for you. One person who spoke into my life and it turned everything. All right. Let's pray, okay? Father, just thank you for these brave men and women who did hard things, who paid huge prices. Just thank you for the imprint that they made on the world and are still making because of their stories. May our stories make an imprint too, whether it's large or small. May people look back and see us and say, if it wasn't for them, I would have been different. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, guys.